The Crowd, A Study of the Popular Mind by Gustave. Book 2, The Opinions and Beliefs of Crowds. Chapter 1, Remote Factors of the Opinions and Beliefs of Crowds. Having studied the mental constitution of crowds and become acquainted with their modes of feeling, thinking, and reasoning, we shall now proceed to examine how their opinions and beliefs arise and become established. The factors which determine these opinions and beliefs are of two kinds: remote factors and immediate factors. The remote factors are those which render crowds capable of adopting certain convictions and absolutely refractory to the acceptance of others. These factors prepare the ground in which are suddenly seen to germinate certain new ideas whose force and consequences are a cause of astonishment, though they are only spontaneous in appearance. The outburst and putting in practice of certain ideas among crowds present at times a startling suddenness. This is only a superficial effect, behind which must be sought a preliminary and preparatory action of long duration. The immediate factors are those which, coming on the top of this long preparatory working, in whose absence they would remain without effect, serve as the source of active persuasion on crowds. That is, they are the factors which cause the idea to take shape and set it loose with all its consequences. The resolutions by which collectivities are suddenly carried away arise out of these immediate factors. It is due to them that a riot breaks out or a strike is decided upon, and to them that enormous majorities invest one man with power to overthrow a government. The successive action of these two kinds of factors is to be traced in all great historical events. The French Revolution, to cite but one of the most striking of such events, had among its remote factors the writings of the philosophers, the exactions of the nobility, and the progress of scientific thought. The mind of the masses, thus prepared, was then easily roused by such immediate factors as the speeches of orators and the resistance of the court party to insignificant reforms. Among the remote factors, there are some of a general nature, which are found to underlie all the beliefs and opinions of crowds. They are race, traditions, time, institutions, and education. We now proceed to study the influence of these different factors. 1. Race. This factor, race, must be placed in the first rank, for in itself it far surpasses in importance all the others. We have sufficiently studied it in another work. It is therefore needless to deal with it again. We showed in a previous volume what an historical race is, and how its character once formed, it possesses, as the result of the laws of heredity, such power that its beliefs, institutions, and arts, in a word, all the elements of its civilization, are merely the outward expression of its genius. We showed that the power of the race is such that no element can pass from one people to another without undergoing the most profound transformations. Environment, circumstances, and events represent the social suggestions of the moment. They may have a considerable influence, but this influence is always momentary if it be contrary to the suggestions of the race, that is, to those which are inherited by a nation from the entire series of its ancestors. We shall have occasion in several of the chapters of this work to touch again upon racial influence, and to show that this influence is so great that it dominates the characteristics peculiar to the genius of crowds. It follows from this fact that the crowds of different countries offer very considerable differences of beliefs and conduct, and are not to be influenced in the same manner. 2. Traditions. Traditions represent the ideas, the needs, and the sentiments of the past. They are the synthesis of the race and weigh upon us with immense force. The biological sciences have been transformed since embryology has shown the immense influence of the past on the evolution of living beings, and the historical sciences will not undergo a less change when this conception has become more widespread. As yet, it is not sufficiently general, and many statesmen are still no further advanced than the theorists of the last century, who believed that a society could break off with its past and be entirely recast on lines suggested solely by the light of reason. A people is an organism created by the past, and like every other organism, it can only be modified by slow, hereditary accumulations. It is tradition that guides men, and more especially so when they are in a crowd. The changes they can effect in their traditions with any ease merely bear, as I often repeated, upon names and outward forms. This circumstance is not to be regretted. Neither a national genius nor civilization would be possible without traditions. In consequence, man's two great concerns since he has existed have been to create a network of traditions which he afterwards endeavors to destroy when their beneficial effects have worn themselves out. Civilization is impossible without traditions, and progress impossible without the destruction of those traditions. The difficulty, and it is an immense difficulty, is to find a proper equilibrium between stability and variability. Should a people allow its customs to become too firmly rooted, it can no longer change and becomes, like China, incapable of improvement. Violent revolutions are in this case of no avail, for what happens is that either the broken fragments of the chain are pieced together again, and the past resumes its empire without change, or the fragments remain apart, and decadence soon succeeds anarchy. The ideal for a people is in consequence to preserve the institutions of the past, merely changing them insensibly and little by little. This ideal is difficult to realize. The Romans in ancient and the English in modern times are almost alone in having realized it. It is precisely crowds that cling the most tenaciously to traditional ideas and oppose their being changed with the most obstinacy. This is notably the case with the category of crowds constituting castes. I have already insisted upon the conservative spirit of crowds, and shown that the most violent rebellions merely end in a changing of words and terms. At the end of the last century, in the presence of destroyed churches, of priests expelled the country or guillotined, it might have been thought that the old religious ideas had lost all their strength, and yet a few years had barely lapsed before the abolished system of public worship had to be re-established in deference to universal demands. Blotted out for a moment, the old traditions had resumed their sway. No example could better display the power of tradition on the mind of crowds. The most redoubtable idols do not dwell in temples, nor the most despotic tyrants in palaces. Both the one and the other can be broken in an instant. But the invisible masters that reign in our innermost selves are safe from every effort at revolt, and only yield to the slow wearing away of centuries. 3. Time. In social as in biological problems, time is one of the most energetic factors. It is the sole real creator and the sole great destroyer. It is time that has made mountains with grains of sand and raised the obscure cell of geological errors to human dignity. The action of centuries is sufficient to transform any given phenomenon. It has been justly observed that an ant with enough time at its disposal could level Mount Blanc. A being possessed of the magical force of varying time at his will would have the power attributed by believers to God. In this place, however, we have only to concern ourselves with the influence of time on the genesis of the opinions of crowds. Its action from this point of view is still immense. Dependent upon it are the great forces such as race, which cannot form themselves without it. It causes the birth, the growth, and the death of all beliefs. It is by the aid of time that they acquire their strength, and also by its aid that they lose it. It is time in particular that prepares the opinions and beliefs of crowds, or at least the soil on which they will germinate. This is why certain ideas are realizable at one epoch and not at another. It is time that accumulates that immense detritus of beliefs and thoughts on which the ideas of a given period spring up. They do not grow at hazard and by chance. The roots of each of them strike down into a long past. When they blossom, it is time that has prepared their blooming, and to arrive at a notion of their genesis, it is always back in the past that it is necessary to search. They are the daughters of the past and the mothers of the future, but throughout, the slaves of time. Time, in consequence, is our veritable master, and it suffices to leave it free to act, to see all things transformed. At the present day, we are very uneasy with regard to the threatening aspirations of the masses and the destructions and upheavals foreboded thereby. Time, without other aid, will see to the restoration of equilibrium. No form of government, M. Lavisse very properly writes, was founded in a day. Political and social organizations are works that demand centuries. The feudal system existed for centuries in a shapeless, chaotic state before it found its laws. Absolute monarchy also existed for centuries before arriving at regular methods of government, and these periods of expectancy were extremely troubled. 4. Political and social institutions. The idea that institutions can remedy the defects of societies, that national progress is the consequence of the improvement of institutions and governments, and that social changes can be effected by decrees, this idea, I say, is still generally accepted. It was the starting point of the French Revolution, and the social theories of the present day are based upon it. The most continuous experience has been unsuccessful in shaking this grave delusion. Philosophers and historians have endeavored in vain to prove its absurdity, but yet they have had no difficulty in demonstrating that institutions are the outcome of ideas, sentiments, and customs, and that ideas, sentiments, and customs are not to be recast by recasting legislative codes. A nation does not choose its institutions at will any more than it chooses the color of its hair or its eyes. Institutions and governments are the product of the race. They are not the creators of an epoch, but are created by it. Peoples are not governed in accordance with their caprices of the moment, but as their character determines that they shall be governed. Centuries are required to form a political system, and centuries needed to change it. Institutions have no intrinsic value. In themselves, they are neither good nor bad. Those which are good at a given moment for a given people may be harmful in the extreme for another nation. Moreover, it is in no way in the power of a people to really change its institutions. Undoubtedly, at the cost of violent revolutions, it can change their name, but in their essence, they remain unmodified. The names are mere futile labels with which an historian who goes to the bottom of things need scarcely concern himself. It is in this way, for instance, that England, the most democratic country in the world, lives nevertheless under a monarchical regime, whereas the countries in which the most oppressive despotism is rampant are the Spanish American republics, in spite of their republican constitutions. The destinies of peoples are determined by their character and not by their government. I have endeavored to establish this view in my previous volume by setting forth categorical examples. To lose time in the manufacture of cut and dried constitutions is, in consequence, a puerile task, the useless labor of an ignorant rhetorician. Necessity and time undertake the charge of elaborating constitutions when we are wise enough to allow these two factors to act. This is the plan the Anglo-Saxons have adopted, as their great historian Macaulay teaches us in a passage that the politicians of all Latin countries ought to learn by heart. After having shown all the good that can be accomplished by laws which appear from the point of view of pure reason a chaos of absurdities and contradictions, he compares the scores of constitutions that have been engulfed in the convulsions of the Latin peoples with that of England, and points out that the latter has only been very slowly changed part by part under the influence of immediate necessities and never of speculative reasoning. To think nothing of symmetry and much of convenience, never to remove an anomaly merely because it is an anomaly, never to innovate except when some grievance is felt, never to innovate except so far as to get rid of the grievance, never to lay down any proposition of wider extent than the particular case for which it is necessary to provide. These are the rules which have, from the age of John to the age of Victoria, generally guided the deliberations of our 250 parliaments. It would be necessary to take one by one the laws and institutions of each people to show to what extent they are the expression of the needs of each race, and are incapable, for that reason, of being violently transformed. It is possible, for instance, to indulge in philosophical dissertations on the advantages and disadvantages of centralization, but when we see a people composed of very different races devote 1,000 years of efforts to attaining to this centralization, when we observe that a great revolution, having for object the destruction of all the institutions of the past, has been forced to respect this centralization, and has even strengthened it, under these circumstances we should admit that it is the outcome of imperious needs, that it is a condition of the existence of the nation in question, and we should pity the poor mental range of politicians who talk of destroying it. Could they, by chance, succeed in this attempt? Their success would at once be the signal for a frightful civil war, which, moreover, would immediately bring back a new system of centralization much more oppressive than the old. The conclusion to be drawn from what precedes is that it is not in institutions that the means is to be sought of profoundly influencing the genius of the masses. When we see certain countries, such as the United States, reach a high degree of prosperity under democratic institutions, while others, such as the Spanish American republics, are found existing in a pitiable state of anarchy under absolutely similar institutions, we should admit that these institutions are as foreign to the greatness of the one as to the decadence of the others. Peoples are governed by their character, and all institutions which are not intimately modeled on that character merely represent a borrowed garment, a transitory disguise. No doubt, sanguinary wars and violent revolutions have been undertaken and will continue to be undertaken to impose institutions to which is attributed, as to the relics of saints, the supernatural power of creating welfare. It may be said, then, in one sense, that institutions react on the mind of the crowd inasmuch as they engender such upheavals. But in reality, it is not the institutions that react in this manner, since we know that, whether triumphant or vanquished, they possess in themselves no virtue. It is illusions and words that have influenced the mind of the crowd, and especially words which are as powerful as they are chimerical, and whose astonishing sway we shall shortly demonstrate. 5. Instruction and education. Foremost among the dominant ideas of the present epoch is to be found the notion that instruction is capable of considerably changing men, and has for its unfailing consequence to improve them and even to make them equal. By the mere fact of its being constantly repeated, this assertion has ended by becoming one of the most steadfast democratic dogmas. It would be as difficult now to attack it as it would have been formerly to have attacked the dogmas of the Church. On this point, however, as on many others, democratic ideas are in profound disagreement with the results of psychology and experience. Many eminent philosophers, among them Herbert Spencer, have had no difficulty in showing that instruction neither renders a man more moral nor happier, that it changes neither his instincts nor his hereditary passions, and that at times, for this to happen, it need only be badly directed. It is much more pernicious than useful. Statisticians have brought confirmation of these views by telling us that criminality increases with the generalization of instruction, or at any rate of a certain kind of instruction, and that the worst enemies of society, the anarchists, are recruited among the prize winners of schools, while in a recent work a distinguished magistrate, M. Adolphe Gilliot, made the observation that at present 3,000 educated criminals are met with for every 1,000 illiterate delinquents, and that in 50 years the criminal percentage of the population has passed from 227 to 552 for every 100,000 inhabitants, an increase of 133%. He has also noted, in common with his colleagues, that criminality is particularly on the increase among young persons, for whom, as is known, gratuitous and obligatory schooling has, in France, replaced apprenticeship. It is not assuredly, and nobody has ever maintained this proposition, that well-directed instruction may not give very useful practical results, if not in the sense of raising the standard of morality, at least in that of developing professional capacity. Unfortunately, the Latin peoples, especially in the last 25 years, have based their systems of instruction on very erroneous principles, and in spite of the observations of the most eminent minds, such as Braille, Faustel de Coulanges, Taine, and many others, they persist in their lamentable mistakes. I have myself shown, in a work published some time ago, that the French system of education transforms the majority of those who have undergone it into enemies of society, and recruits numerous disciples for the worst forms of socialism. The primary danger of this system of education, verily properly qualified as Latin, consists in the fact that it is based on the fundamental psychological error that the intelligence is developed by the learning by heart of textbooks. Adopting this view, the endeavor has been made to enforce a knowledge of as many handbooks as possible. From the primary school till he leaves the university, a young man does nothing but acquire books by heart, without his judgment or personal initiative being ever called into play. Education consists for him in reciting by heart and obeying, learning lessons, knowing by heart a grammar or a compendium, repeating well and imitating well. That, writes a former Minister of Public Instruction, M. Jules Simon, is a ludicrous form of education whose every effort is an act of faith, tacitly admitting the infallibility of the master, and whose only results are a belittling of ourselves and a rendering of us impotent. Were this education merely useless, one might confine oneself to expressing compassion for the unhappy children who, instead of making needful studies at the primary school, are instructed in the genealogy of the sons of Clotaire, the conflicts between Neustria and Australia, or zoological classifications. But the system presents a far more serious danger. It gives those who have been submitted to it a violent dislike to the state of life in which they were born, and an intense desire to escape from it. The working man no longer wishes to remain a working man, or the peasant to continue a peasant, while the most humble members of the middle class admit of no possible career for their sons except that of state-paid functionaries. Instead of preparing men for life, French schools solely prepare them to occupy public functions, in which success can be attained without any necessity for self-direction or the exhibition of the least glimmer of personal initiative. At the bottom of the social ladder, the system creates an army of proletarians discontented with their lot and always ready to revolt, while at the summit it brings into being a frivolous bourgeoisie, at once skeptical and credulous, having a superstitious confidence in the state, whom it regards as a sort of providence, but without forgetting to display towards it a ceaseless hostility, always laying its own faults to the door of the government, and incapable of the least enterprise without the intervention of the authorities. The state, which manufactures by dint of textbooks all these persons possessing diplomas, can only utilize a small number of them, and is forced to leave the others without employment. It is obliged, in consequence, to resign itself to feeding the first mentioned and to having the others as its enemies. From the top to the bottom of the social pyramid, from the humblest clerk to the professor and the prefect, the immense mass of persons boasting diplomas besiege the professions. While a businessman has the greatest difficulty in finding an agent to represent him in the colonies, thousands of candidates solicit the most modest official post. There are 20,000 schoolmasters and mistresses without employment in the department of the Seine alone, all of them persons who, disdaining the fields or the workshops, look to the state for their livelihood. The number of the chosen being restricted, that of the discontented is perforce immense. The latter are ready for any revolution, whoever be its chiefs, and whatever the goal they aim at. The acquisition of knowledge for which no use can be found is a sure method of driving a man to revolt. It is evidently too late to retrace our steps. Experience alone, that supreme educator of peoples, will be at pains to show us our mistake. It alone will be powerful enough to prove the necessity of replacing our odious textbooks and our pitiable examinations by industrial instruction, capable of inducing our young men to return to the fields, to the workshop, and to the colonial enterprise which they avoid today at all costs. The professional instruction which all enlightened minds are now demanding was the instruction received in the past by our forefathers. It is still in vigor at the present day among the nations who rule the world by their force of will, their initiative, and their spirit of enterprise. In a series of remarkable pages, whose principal passages I reproduce further on, a great thinker, M. Taine, has clearly shown that our former system of education was approximately that in vogue today in England and America. And in a remarkable parallel between the Latin and Anglo-Saxon systems, he has plainly pointed out the consequences of the two methods. One might consent, perhaps, at a pinch, to continue to accept all the disadvantages of our classical education, although it produced nothing but discontented men and men unfitted for their station in life. Did the superficial acquisition of so much knowledge, the faultless repeating by heart of so many textbooks, raise the level of intelligence? But does it really raise this level? Alas, no. The conditions of success in life are the possession of judgment, experience, initiative, and character, qualities which are not bestowed by books. Books are dictionaries, which it is useful to consult, but of which it is perfectly useless to have lengthy portions in one's head. How is it possible for professional instruction to develop the intelligence in a measure quite beyond the reach of classical instruction? This has been well shown by M. Taine. Ideas, he says, are only formed in their natural and normal surroundings. The promotion of the growth is effected by the innumerable impressions appealing to the senses which a young man receives daily in the workshop, the mine, the law court, the study, the builder's yard, the hospital, at the sight of tools, materials, and operations, in the presence of customers, workers, and labor, of work well or ill done, costly or lucrative, in such a way are obtained those trifling perceptions of detail of the eyes, the ear, the hand, and even the sense of smell, which, picked up involuntarily and silently elaborated, take shape within the learner and suggest to him sooner or later this or that new combination, simplification, economy, improvement, or invention. The young Frenchman is deprived, and precisely at the age when they are most fruitful, of all these precious contacts, of all these indispensable elements of assimilation. For 7 or 8 years on end he is shut up in a school, and is cut off from that direct personal experience which would give him a keen and exact notion of men and things and of the various ways of handling them. At least 9 out of 10 have wasted their time and pains during several years of their life. Telling, important, even decisive years. Among such are to be counted, first of all, the half or 2/3 of those who present themselves for examination. I refer to those who are rejected, and then among those who are successful, who obtain a degree, a certificate, a diploma. There is still a half or 2/3. I refer to the overworked. Too much has been demanded of them by exacting that on a given day, on a chair, or before a board, they should, for 2 hours in succession, and with respect to a group of sciences, be living repertoires of all human knowledge. In point of fact, they were that, or nearly so, for 2 hours on that particular day, but a month later they are so no longer. They could not go through the examination again. Their too numerous and too burdensome acquisitions slip incessantly from their mind, and are not replaced. Their mental vigor has declined. Their fertile capacity for growth has dried up. The fully developed man appears, and he is often a used up man. Settled down, married, resigned to turning in a circle, and indefinitely in the same circle. He shuts himself up in his confined function, which he fulfills adequately, but nothing more. Such is the average yield. Assuredly, the receipts do not balance the expenditure. In England or America, where, as in France previous to 1789, the contrary proceeding is adopted, the outcome obtained is equal or superior. The illustrious psychologist subsequently shows us the difference between our system and that of the Anglo-Saxons. The latter do not possess our innumerable special tools. With them, instruction is not based on book learning, but on object lessons. The engineer, for example, is trained in a workshop and never at a school, a method which allows of each individual reaching the level his intelligence permits of. He becomes a workman or a foreman if he can get no further. An engineer if his aptitudes take him as far. This manner of proceeding is much more democratic and of much more greater benefit to society than that of making the whole career of an individual depend on an examination lasting a few hours and undergone at the age of 19 or 20. In the hospital, the mine, the factory, in the architect's or the lawyer's office, the student, who makes a start while very young, goes through his apprenticeship stage by stage, much as does with us a law clerk in his office or an artist in his studio. Previously, and before making a practical beginning, he has had an opportunity of following some general and summary course of instruction, so as to have a framework ready prepared in which to store the observations he is shortly to make. Furthermore, he is able, as a rule, to avail himself of sundry technical courses which he can follow in his leisure hours, so as to coordinate step by step the daily experience he is gathering. Under such a system, the practical capabilities increase and develop of themselves in exact proportion to the faculties of the student, and in the direction requisite for his future task and the special work for which from now onwards he desires to fit himself. By this means, in England or the United States, a young man is quickly in a position to develop his capacity to the utmost. At 25 years of age, and much sooner, if the material and the parts are there, he is not merely a useful performer. He is capable also of spontaneous enterprise. He is not only a part of a machine, but also a motor. In France, where the contrary system prevails, in France, which with each succeeding generation is falling more and more into line with China, the sum total of the wasted forces is enormous. The great philosopher arrives at the following conclusion with respect to the growing incongruity between our Latin system of education and the requirements of practical life. In the three stages of instruction, those of childhood, adolescence, and youth, the theoretical and pedagogic preparation by books on the school benches has lengthened out and become overcharged in view of the examination, the degree, the diploma, and the certificate, and solely in this view, and by the worst methods, by the application of an unnatural and antisocial regime, by the excessive postponement of the practical apprenticeship, by our boarding school system, by artificial training and mechanical cramming, by overwork, without thought for the time that is to follow, for the adult age and the functions of the man, without regard for the real world on which the young man will shortly be thrown, for the society in which we move and to which he must be adapted or be taught to resign himself in advance, for the struggle in which humanity is engaged, and in which to defend himself and to keep his footing he ought previously to have been equipped, armed, trained, and hardened. This indispensable equipment, this acquisition of more importance than any other, this sturdy common sense and nerve and willpower our schools do not procure the young Frenchman. On the contrary, far from qualifying him for his approaching and definite state, they disqualify him. In consequence, his entry into the world and his first steps in the field of action are most often merely a succession of painful falls, whose effect is that he long remains wounded and bruised, and sometimes disabled for life. The test is severe and dangerous. In the course of it, the mental and moral equilibrium is affected, and runs the risk of not being reestablished. Too sudden and complete disillusion has supervened. The deceptions have been too great, the disappointments too keen. Have we digressed in what precedes from the psychology of crowds? Assuredly not. If we desire to understand the ideas and beliefs that are germinating today in the masses and will spring up tomorrow, it is necessary to know how the ground has been prepared. The instruction given the youth of a country allows of a knowledge of what that country will one day be. The education according the present generation justifies the most gloomy provisions. It is in part by instruction and education that the mind of the masses is improved or deteriorated. It was necessary in consequence to show how this mind has been fashioned by the system in vogue, and how the mass of the indifferent and the neutral has become progressively an army of the discontented, ready to obey all the suggestions of utopians and rhetoricians. It is in the schoolroom that the socialists and anarchists are found nowadays, and that the way is being paved for the approaching period of decadence for the Latin peoples. Chapter 2. The immediate factors of the opinions of crowds. We have just investigated the remote and preparatory factors which give the mind of crowds a special receptivity and make possible therein the growth of certain sentiments and certain ideas. It now remains for us to study the factors capable of acting in a direct manner. We shall see in a forthcoming chapter how these factors should be put in force in order that they may produce their full effect. In the first part of this work, we studied the sentiments, ideas, and methods of reasoning of collective bodies, and from the knowledge thus acquired, it would evidently be possible to deduce in a general way the means of making an impression on their mind. We already know what strikes the imagination of crowds, and are acquainted with the power and contagiousness of suggestions, of those especially that are presented under the form of images. However, as suggestions may proceed from very different sources, the factors capable of acting on the minds of crowds may differ considerably. It is necessary, then, to study them separately. This is not a useless study. Crowds are somewhat like the Sphinx of an ancient fable. It is necessary to arrive at a solution of the problems offered by their psychology, or to resign ourselves to being devoured by them. 1. Images, words, and formulas. When studying the imagination of crowds, we saw that it is particularly open to the impressions produced by images. These images do not always lie ready to hand, but it is possible to evoke them by the judicious employment of words and formulas. Handled with art, they possess in sober truth the mysterious power formerly attributed to them by the adepts of magic. They cause the birth in the minds of crowds of the most formidable tempests, which in turn they are capable of stilling. A pyramid far loftier than that of old Cheops could be raised merely with the bones of men who have been victims of the power of words and formulas. The power of words is bound up with the images they evoke, and is quite independent of their real significance. Words whose sense is the most ill-defined are sometimes those that possess the most influence. Such, for example, are the terms democracy, socialism, equality, liberty, etc., whose meaning is so vague that bulky volumes do not suffice to precisely fix it. Yet it is certain that a truly magical power is attached to those short syllables, as if they contained the solution of all problems. They synthesize the most diverse unconscious aspirations and the hope of their realization. Reason and arguments are incapable of combating certain words and formulas. They are uttered with solemnity in the presence of crowds, and as soon as they have been pronounced, an expression of respect is visible on every countenance, and all heads are bowed. By many, they are considered as natural forces, as supernatural powers. They evoke grandiose and vague images in men's minds, but this very vagueness that wraps them in obscurity augments their mysterious power. They are the mysterious divinities hidden behind the tabernacle, which the devout only approach in fear and trembling. The images evoked by words, being independent of their sense, they vary from age to age and from people to people, the formulas remaining identical. Certain transitory images are attached to certain words. The word is merely as it were the button of an electric bell that calls them up. All words and all formulas do not possess the power of evoking images, while there are some which have once had this power but lose it in the course of use, and cease to waken any response in the mind. They then become vain sounds, whose principal utility is to relieve the person who employs them of the obligation of thinking. Armed with a small stock of formulas and commonplaces learnt while we are young, we possess all that is needed to traverse life without the tiring necessity of having to reflect on anything whatever. If any particular language be studied, it is seen that the words of which it is composed change rather slowly in the course of ages, while the images these words evoke, or the meaning attached to them, changes ceaselessly. This is the reason why, in another work, I have arrived at the conclusion that the absolute translation of a language, especially of a dead language, is totally impossible. What do we do in reality when we substitute a French for a Latin, Greek, or Sanskrit expression, or even when we endeavor to understand a book written in our own tongue 2 or 3 centuries back? We merely put the images and ideas with which modern life has endowed our intelligence in the place of absolutely distinct notions and images which ancient life had brought into being in the mind of races submitted to conditions of existence having no analogy with our own. When the men of the Revolution imagined they were copying the Greeks and Romans, what were they doing except giving to ancient words a sense the latter had never had? What resemblance can possibly exist between the institutions of the Greeks and those designated today by corresponding words? A republic at that epoch was an essentially aristocratic institution, formed of a reunion of petty despots ruling over a crowd of slaves kept in the most absolute subjection. These communal aristocracies based on slavery could not have existed for a moment without it. The word liberty, again, what signification could it have in any way resembling that we attribute to it today, at a period when the possibility of the liberty of thought was not even suspected, and when there was no greater and more exceptional crime than that of discussing the gods, the laws, and the customs of the city? What did such a word as fatherland signify to an Athenian or Spartan, unless it were the cult of Athens or Sparta, and in no wise that of Greece, composed of rival cities, always at war with each other? What meaning had the same word fatherland among the ancient Gauls, divided into rival tribes and races and possessing different languages and religions, and who were easily vanquished by Caesar because he always found allies among them? It was Rome that made a country of Gaul by endowing it with political and religious unity. Without going back so far, scarcely 2 centuries ago, is it to be believed that this same notion of a fatherland was conceived to have the same meaning as at present by French princes like the great Condé, who allied themselves with the foreigner against their sovereign? And yet again, the same word, had it not a sense very different from the modern, for the French royalist emigrants, who thought they obeyed the laws of honor in fighting against France, and who, from their point of view, did indeed obey them, since the feudal law bound the vassal to the lord and not to the soil, so that where the sovereign was, there was the true fatherland. Numerous are the words whose meaning has thus profoundly changed from age to age, words which we can only arrive at understanding in the sense in which they were formerly understood after a long effort. It has been said with truth that much study is necessary merely to arrive at conceiving what was signified to our great-grandfathers by such words as king and the royal family. What then is likely to be the case with terms still more complex? Words then have only mobile and transitory significations which change from age to age and people to people, and when we desire to exert an influence by their means on the crowd, what it is requisite to know is the meaning given them by the crowd at a given moment, and not the meaning which they formerly had or may yet have for individuals of a different mental constitution. Thus, when crowds have come, as the result of political upheavals or changes of belief, to acquire a profound antipathy for the images evoked by certain words, the first duty of the true statesman is to change the words without, of course, laying hands on the things themselves, the latter being too intimately bound up with the inherited constitution to be transformed. The judicious Tocqueville long ago made the remark that the work of the consulates and the empire consisted more particularly in the clothing with new words of the greater part of the institutions of the past. That is to say, in replacing words evoking disagreeable images in the imagination of the crowds by other words of which the novelty prevented such evocations. The tally, or tallage, has become the land tax. The gabelle, the tax on salt. The aids, the indirect contributions and the consolidated duties. The tax on trade companies and the guilds and license, etc. One of the most essential functions of statesmen consists then in baptizing with popular, or at any rate in different words, things the crowds cannot endure under their old names. The power of words is so great that it suffices to designate in well-chosen terms the most odious things to make them acceptable to crowds. Taine justly observes that it was by invoking liberty and fraternity, words very popular at the time, that the Jacobins were able to install a despotism worthy of Dahomey, a tribunal similar to that of the Inquisition, and to accomplish human hecatombs akin to those of ancient Mexico. The art of those who govern, as is the case with the art of advocates, consists above all in the science of employing words. One of the greatest difficulties of this art is that in one and the same society, the same words most often have very different meanings for the different social classes who employ in appearance the same words, but never speak the same language. In the preceding examples, it is especially time that has been made to intervene as the principal factor in the changing of the meaning of words. If, however, we also make race intervene, we shall then see that at the same period, among peoples equally civilized but of a different race, the same words very often correspond to extremely dissimilar ideas. It is impossible to understand these differences without having traveled much, and for this reason I shall not insist upon them. I shall confine myself to observing that it is precisely the words most often employed by the masses which among different peoples possess the most different meanings. Such is the case, for instance, with the words democracy and socialism, in such frequent use nowadays. In reality, they correspond to quite contrary ideas and images in the Latin and Anglo-Saxon mind. For the Latin peoples, the word democracy signifies more especially the subordination of the will and the initiative of the individual to the will and the initiative of the community represented by the state. It is the state that is charged to a greater and greater degree with the direction of everything, the centralization, the monopolization, and the manufacture of everything. To the state, it is that all parties, without exception, radicals, socialists, or monarchists, constantly appeal. Among the Anglo-Saxons, and notably in America, this same word democracy signifies, on the contrary, the intense development of the will of the individual, and as complete a subordination as possible of the state, which, with the exception of the police, the army, and diplomatic relations, it is not allowed the direction of anything, not even of public instruction. It is seen, then, that the same word which signifies for one people the subordination of the will and the initiative of the individual and the preponderance of the state, signifies for another the excessive development of the will and the initiative of the individual and the complete subordination of the state. 2. Illusions. From the dawn of civilization onwards, crowds have always undergone the influence of illusions. It is to the creators of illusions that they have raised more temples, statues, and altars than to any other class of men, whether it be the religious illusions of the past or the philosophic and social illusions of the present. These formidable sovereign powers are always found at the head of all the civilizations that have successively flourished on our planet. It is in their name that were built the temples of Chaldea and Egypt, and the religious edifices of the Middle Ages, and that a vast upheaval shook the whole of Europe a century ago. And there is not one of our political, artistic, or social conceptions that is free from the powerful impress. Occasionally, at the cost of terrible disturbances, man overthrows them, but he seems condemned to always set them up again. Without them he would never have emerged from his primitive barbarian state, and without them again he would soon return to it. Doubtless they are futile shadows, but these children of our dreams have forced the nations to create whatever the arts may boast of splendor or civilization of greatness. If one destroyed in museums and libraries, if one hurled down on the flagstones before the churches all the works and all the monuments of art that religions have expired, what would remain of the great dreams of humanity? To give to men that portion of hope and illusion without which they cannot live, such is the reason for the existence of gods, heroes, and poets. During 50 years, science appeared to undertake this task, but science has been compromised in hearts, hungering after the ideal, because it does not dare to be lavish enough of promises, because it cannot lie. The philosophers of the last century devoted themselves with fervor to the destruction of the religious, political, and social illusions on which our forefathers had lived for a long tale of centuries. By destroying them, they have dried up the springs of hope and resignation. Behind the immolated chimeras, they came face to face with the blind and silent forces of nature, which are inexorable to weakness and ignore pity. Notwithstanding all its progress, philosophy has been unable as yet to offer the masses any ideal that can charm them. But as they must have their illusions at all costs, they turn instinctively, as the insect seeks delight, to the rhetoricians who accord them what they want. Not truth, but error has always been the chief factor in the evolution of nations. And the reasons why socialism is so powerful today is that it constitutes the last illusion that is still vital. In spite of all scientific demonstrations, it continues on the increase. Its principal strength lies in the fact that it is championed by minds sufficiently ignorant of things as they are in reality to venture boldly to promise mankind happiness. The social illusion reigns today upon all the heaped up ruins of the past, and to it belongs the future. The masses have never thirsted after truth. They turn aside from evidence that is not to their taste, preferring to deify error, if error seduce them. Whoever can supply them with illusions is easily their master. Whoever attempts to destroy their illusions is always their victim. 3. Experience. Experience constitutes almost the only effective process by which a truth may be solidly established in the mind of the masses, and illusions grown too dangerous be destroyed. To this end, however, it is necessary that the experience should take place on a very large scale and be very frequently repeated. The experiences undergone by one generation are useless as a rule for the generation that follows, which is the reason why historical facts, cited with a view to demonstration, serve no purpose. Their only utility is to prove to what an extent experiences need to be repeated from age to age to exert any influence, or to be successful in merely shaking an erroneous opinion when it is solidly implanted in the mind of the masses. Our century, and that which preceded it, will doubtless be alluded to by historians as an era of curious experiments, which in no other age have been tried in such number. The most gigantic of these experiments was the French Revolution, to find out that a society is not to be refashioned from top to bottom in accordance with the dictates of pure reason, it was necessary that several millions of men should be massacred and that Europe should be profoundly disturbed for a period of 20 years. To prove to us experimentally that dictators cost the nations who acclaim them dear, 2 ruinous experiences have been required in 50 years. And in spite of their clearness, they do not seem to have been sufficiently convincing. The first, nevertheless, cost 3 millions of men and an invasion. The second involved a loss of territory and carried in its wake the necessity for permanent armies. A third was almost attempted not long since, and will assuredly be attempted one day. To bring an entire nation to admit that the huge German army was not, as was currently alleged 30 years ago, a sort of harmless National Guard, the terrible war which cost us so dear had to take place. To bring about the recognition that protection ruins the nations who adopt it, at least 20 years of disastrous experience will be needful. These examples might be indefinitely multiplied. 4. Reason. In enumerating the factors capable of making an impression on the minds of crowds, all mention of reason might be dispensed with, were it not necessary to point out the negative value of its influence. We have already shown that crowds are not to be influenced by reasoning, and can only comprehend rough and ready associations of ideas. The orators who know how to make an impression upon them always appeal in consequence to their sentiments and never to their reason. The laws of logic have no action on crowds. To bring home conviction to crowds, it is necessary, first of all, to thoroughly comprehend the sentiments by which they are animated, to pretend to share these sentiments, then to endeavor to modify them by calling up, by means of rudimentary associations, certain eminently suggestive notions, to be capable, if need be, of going back to the point of view from which a start was made, and, above all, to divine from instant to instant the sentiments to which one's discourse is giving birth. This necessity of ceaselessly varying one's language in accordance with the effect produced at the moment of speaking deprives from the outset of a prepared and studied harangue of all efficaciousness. In such a speech, the orator follows his own line of thought, not that of his hearers, and from this fact alone his influence is annihilated. Logical minds, accustomed to being convinced by a chain of somewhat close reasoning, cannot avoid having recourse to this mode of persuasion when addressing crowds, and the inability of their arguments always surprises them. The usual mathematical consequences based on the syllogism, that is, on associations of identities, are imperative, writes a logician. This imperativeness would enforce the assent even of an inorganic mass were it capable of following associations of identities. This is doubtless true, but a crowd is no more capable than an inorganic mass of following such associations, nor even of understanding them. If the attempt be made to convince by reasoning primitive minds, savages or children, for instance, the slight value possessed by this method of arguing will be understood. It is not even necessary to descend so low as primitive beings to obtain an insight into the utter powerlessness of reasoning when it has to fight against sentiment. Let us merely call to mind how tenacious, for centuries long, have been religious superstitions in contradiction with the simplest logic. For nearly 2,000 years, the most luminous geniuses have bowed before their laws, and modern times have to be reached for their veracity to be merely contested. The Middle Ages and the Renaissance possessed many enlightened men, but not a single man who attained by reasoning to an appreciation of the childish side of his superstitions, or who promulgated even a slight doubt as to the misdeeds of the devil or the necessity of burning sorcerers. Should it be regretted that crowds are never guided by reason? We would not venture to affirm it. Without a doubt, human reason would not have availed to spur humanity along the path of civilization with the ardor and hardihood its illusions have done. These illusions, the offspring of those unconscious forces by which we are led, were doubtless necessary. Every race carries in its mental constitution the laws of its destiny, and it is perhaps these laws that it obeys with a resistless impulse. Even in the case of those of its impulses which apparently are the most unreasoned, it seems at times as if nations were submitted to secret forces analogous to those which compel the acorn to transform itself into an oak, or a comet to follow its orbit. What little insight we can get into these forces must be sought for in the general course of the evolution of a people, and not in the isolated facts from which this evolution appears at times to proceed. Were these facts alone to be taken into consideration, history would seem to be the result of a series of improbable chances. It was improbable that a Galilean carpenter should become for 2,000 years an all-powerful God in whose name the most important civilizations were founded. Improbable, too, that a few bands of Arabs emerging from their deserts should conquer the greater part of the old Greco-Roman world and establish an empire greater than that of Alexander. Improbable again that in Europe, at an advanced period of its development, and when authority throughout it had been systematically hierarchized, an obscure lieutenant of artillery should have succeeded in reigning over a multitude of people and kings. Let us leave reason, then, to philosophers, and not insist too strongly on its intervention in the governing of men. It is not by reason, but most often in spite of it, that are created those sentiments that are the mainsprings of all civilization. Sentiments such as honor, self-sacrifice, religious faith, patriotism, and the love of glory. Chapter 3. The leaders of crowds and their means of persuasion. We are now acquainted with the mental constitution of crowds, and we also know what are the motives capable of making an impression on their mind. It remains to investigate how these motives may be set in action, and by whom they may usefully be turned to practical account. 1. The leaders of crowds. As soon as a certain number of living beings are gathered together, whether they be animals or men, they place themselves instinctively under the authority of a chief. In the case of human crowds, the chief is often nothing more than a ringleader or agitator, but as such he plays a considerable part. His will is the nucleus around which the opinions of the crowd are grouped and attain to identity. He constitutes the first element towards the organization of heterogeneous crowds, and paves the way for their organization in sects. In the meantime, he directs them. A crowd is a servile flock that is incapable of ever doing without a master. The leader has most often started as one of the led. He has himself been hypnotized by the idea, whose apostle he has since become. It has taken possession of him to such a degree that everything outside it vanishes, and that every contrary opinion appears to him an error or a superstition. An example in point is Robespierre. Hypnotized by the philosophical ideas of Rousseau, and employing the methods of the Inquisition to propagate them. The leaders we speak of are more frequently men of action than thinkers. They are not gifted with keen foresight, nor could they be, as this quality generally conduces to doubt and inactivity. They are especially recruited from the ranks of those morbidly nervous, excitable, half-deranged persons who are bordering on madness. However absurd may be the idea they uphold or the goal they pursue, their convictions are so strong that all reasoning is lost upon them. Contempt and persecution do not affect them, or only serve more. They sacrifice their personal interest, their family, everything. The very instinct of self-preservation is entirely obliterated in them, and so much that often the only recompense they solicit is that of martyrdom. The intensity of their faith gives great power of suggestion to their words. The multitude is always ready to listen to the strong-willed man who knows how to impose himself upon it. Men gathered in a crowd lose all force of will and turn instinctively to the person who possesses the quality they lack. Nations have never lacked leaders, but all of the latter have by no means been animated by those strong convictions proper to apostles. These leaders are often subtle rhetoricians, seeking only their own personal interests and endeavoring to persuade by flattering base instincts. The influence they can exert in this manner may be very great, but it is always ephemeral. The men of ardent convictions who have stirred the soul of crowds, the Peter, the Hermits, the Luthers, the Savonarolas, the men of the French Revolution, have only exercised their fascination after having been themselves fascinated first of all by a creed. They are then able to call up in the souls of their fellows that formidable force known as faith, which renders a man the absolute slave of his dream. The rousing of faith, whether religious, political, or social, whether faith in a work, in a person, or an idea, has always been the function of the great leaders of crowds, and it is on this account that their influence is always very great. Of all the forces at the disposal of humanity, faith has always been one of the most tremendous, and the gospel rightly attributes to it the power of moving mountains. To endow a man with faith is to multiply his strength tenfold. The great events of history have been brought about by obscure believers who have had little beyond their faith in their favor. It is not by the aid of the learned or of philosophers, and still less of skeptics, that have been built up the great religions which have swayed the world, or the vast empires which have spread from one hemisphere to the other. In the cases just cited, however, we are dealing with great leaders, and they are so few in number that history can easily reckon them up. They form the summit of a continuous series which extends from these powerful masters of men down to the workman who, in the smoky atmosphere of an inn, slowly fascinates his comrades by ceaselessly drumming into their ears a few set phrases, whose purport he scarcely comprehends, but the application of which, according to him, must surely bring about the realization of all dreams and of every hope. In every social sphere, from the highest to the lowest, as soon as a man ceases to be isolated, he speedily falls under the influence of a leader. The majority of men, especially among the masses, do not possess clear and reasoned ideas on any subject, whatever outside their own specialty. The leader serves them as guide. It is just possible that he may be replaced, though very inefficiently, by the periodical publications which manufacture opinions for their readers and supply them with ready-made phrases which dispense them of the trouble of reasoning. The leaders of crowds wield a very despotic authority, and this despotism indeed is a condition of their obtaining a following. It has often been remarked how easily they extort obedience, although without any means of backing up their authority, from the most turbulent section of the working classes. They fix the hours of labor and the rate of wages, and they decree strikes, which are begun and ended at the hour they ordain. At the present day, these leaders and agitators tend more and more to usurp the place of the public authorities in proportion as the latter allow themselves to be called in question and shorn of their strength. The tyranny of these new masters has for result that the crowds obey them much more docilely than they have obeyed any government. If in consequence of some accident or other the leaders should be removed from the scene, the crowd returns to its original state of a collectivity without cohesion or force of resistance. During the last strike of the Parisian omnibus employees, the arrest of the two leaders who were directing it was at once sufficient to bring it to an end. It is the need not of liberty but of servitude that is always predominant in the soul of crowds. They are so bent on obedience that they instinctively submit to whoever declares himself their master. These ringleaders and agitators may be divided into two clearly defined classes. The one includes the men who are energetic and possess, but only intermittently, much strength of will. The other, the men, far rarer than the preceding, whose strength of will is enduring. The first mentioned are violent, brave, and audacious. They are more especially useful to direct a violent enterprise suddenly decided on, to carry the masses with them in spite of danger, and to transform into heroes the men who but yesterday were recruits. Men of this kind were Ney and Murat under the First Empire, and such a man in our own time was Garibaldi, a talentless but energetic adventurer who succeeded with a handful of men in laying hands on the ancient kingdom of Naples, defended though it was by a disciplined army. Still, though, the energy of leaders of this class is a force to be reckoned with. It is transitory and scarcely outlasts the exciting cause that has brought it into play. When they have returned to their ordinary course of life, the heroes, animated by energy of this description, often evince, as was the case with those I have just cited, the most astonishing weakness of character. They seem incapable of reflection and of conducting themselves under the simplest circumstances, although they had been able to lead others. These men are leaders who cannot exercise their function except on the condition that they be led themselves and continually stimulated, that they have always as their beacon a man or an idea, that they follow a line of conduct clearly traced. The second category of leaders, that of men of enduring strength of will, have, in spite of a less brilliant aspect, a much more considerable influence. In this category are to be found the true founders of religious and great undertakings, St. Paul, Muhammad, Christopher Columbus, and de Lesseps, for example. Whether they be intelligent or narrow-minded is of no importance. The world belongs to them. The persistent will force they possess is an immensely rare and immensely powerful faculty to which everything yields. What a strong and continuous will is capable of is not always properly appreciated. Nothing resists it, neither nature, gods, nor men. The most recent example of what can be effected by a strong and continuous will is afforded us by the illustrious man who separated the Eastern and Western worlds, and accomplished a task that during 3,000 years had been attempted in vain by the greatest sovereigns. He failed later in an identical enterprise, but then had intervened old age, to which everything, even the will, succumbs. When it is desired to show what may be done by mere strength of will, all that is necessary is to relate in detail the history of the difficulties that had to be surmounted in connection with the cutting of the Suez Canal. An ocular witness, Dr. Curzelius, has summed up in a few striking lines the entire story of this great work, recounted by its immortal author. From day to day, episode by episode, he told the stupendous story of the canal. He told of all he had to vanquish, of the impossible he had made possible, of all the opposition he encountered, of the coalition against him and the disappointments, the reverses, the defeats which had been unavailing to discourage or depress him. He recalled how England had combated him, attacking him without cessation, how Egypt and France had hesitated, how the French consul had been foremost in his opposition to the early stages of the work, and the nature of the opposition he had met with, the attempt to force his workmen to desert from thirst by refusing them fresh water, how the Minister of Marine and the engineers, all responsible men of experienced and scientific training, had naturally all been hostile, were all certain on scientific grounds that disaster was at hand, had calculated its coming, foretelling it for such a day and hour as an eclipse is foretold. The book which relates the lives of all these great leaders would not contain many names, but these names have been bound up with the most important events in the history of civilization. 2. The means of action of the leaders: affirmation, repetition, contagion. When it is wanted to stir up a crowd for a short space of time, to induce it to commit an act of any nature, to pillage a palace, or to die in defense of a stronghold, or a barricade, for instance, the crowd must be acted upon by rapid suggestion, among which example is the most powerful in its effect. To attain this end, however, it is necessary that the crowd should have been previously prepared by certain circumstances, and, above all, that he who wishes to work upon it should possess the quality to be studied farther on, to which I give the name of prestige. When, however, it is proposed to imbue the mind of a crowd with ideas and beliefs, with modern social theories, for instance, the leaders have recourse to different expedients. The principal of them are 3 in number and clearly defined: affirmation, repetition, and contagion. Their action is somewhat slow, but its effects, once produced, are very lasting. Affirmation, pure and simple, kept free of all reasoning and all proof, is one of the surest means of making an idea enter the crowd mind. The conciser an affirmation is, the more destitute of every appearance of proof and demonstration, the more weight it carries. The religious books and the legal codes of all ages have always resorted to simple affirmation. Statesmen called upon to defend a political cause and commercial men pushing the sale of their products by means of advertising are acquainted with the value of affirmation. Affirmation, however, has no real influence unless it be constantly repeated, and so far as possible in the same terms. It was Napoleon, I believe, who said that there is only one figure in rhetoric of serious importance, namely repetition. The thing affirmed comes by repetition to fix itself in the mind in such a way that it is accepted in the end as a demonstrated truth. The influence of repetition on crowds is comprehensible when the power is seen which it exercises on the most enlightened minds. This power is due to the fact that the repeated statement is embedded in the long run in those profound regions of our unconscious selves in which the motives of our actions are forged. At the end of a certain time, we have forgotten who is the author of the repeated assertion, and we finish by believing it. To this circumstance is due the astonishing power of advertisements. When we have read 100, 1,000 times that X's chocolate is the best, we imagine we have heard it said in many quarters, and we end by acquiring the certitude that such is the fact. When we have read 1,000 times that Y's flour has cured the most illustrious persons of the most obstinate maladies, we are tempted at last to try it when suffering from an illness of a similar kind. If we always read in the same papers that A is an arrant scamp and B a most honest man, we finish by being convinced that this is the truth, unless indeed we are given to reading another paper of the contrary opinion, in which the two qualifications are reversed. Affirmation and repetition are alone powerful enough to combat each other. When an affirmation has been sufficiently repeated, and there is unanimity in this repetition, as has occurred in the case of certain famous financial undertakings, rich enough to purchase every assistance, what is called a current of opinion is formed and the powerful mechanism of contagion intervenes. Ideas, sentiments, emotions, and beliefs possess in crowds a contagious power as intense as that of microbes. This phenomenon is very natural, since it is observed even in animals when they are together in number. Should a horse in a stable take to biting its manager, the other horses in the stable will imitate him. A panic that has seized on a few sheep will soon extend to the whole flock. In the case of men collected in a crowd, all emotions are very rapidly contagious, which explains the suddenness of panics. Brain disorders, like madness, are themselves contagious. The frequency of madness among doctors who are specialists for the mad is notorious. Indeed, forms of madness have recently been cited. Agoraphobia, for instance, which are communicable from men to animals. For individuals to succumb to contagion, their simultaneous presence on the same spot is not indispensable. The action of contagion may be felt from a distance under the influence of events which give all minds an individual trend and the characteristics peculiar to crowds. This is especially the case when men's minds have been prepared to undergo the influence in question by those remote factors of which I have made a study above. An example in point is the revolutionary movement of 1848, which, after breaking out in Paris, spread rapidly over a great part of Europe and shook a number of thrones. Imitation, to which so much influence is attributed in social phenomena, is in reality a mere effect of contagion. Having shown its influence elsewhere, I shall confine myself to reproducing what I said on the subject 15 years ago. My remarks have since been developed by other writers in recent publications. Man, like animals, has a natural tendency to imitation. Imitation is a necessity for him, provided always that the imitation is quite easy. It is this necessity that makes the influence of what is called fashion so powerful. Whether in the matter of opinions, ideas, literary manifestations, or merely of dress, how many persons are bold enough to run counter to the fashion? It is by examples, not by arguments, that crowds are guided. At every period there exists a small number of individualities which react upon the remainder and are imitated by the unconscious mass. It is needful, however, that these individualities should not be in too pronounced disagreement with received ideas. Were they so, to imitate them would be too difficult, and their influence would be nil. For this very reason, men who are too superior to their epoch are generally without influence upon it. The line of separation is too strongly marked. For this same reason, too, Europeans, in spite of all the advantages of their civilization, have so insignificant an influence on Eastern people. They differ from them to too great an extent. The dual action of the past and of reciprocal imitation renders in the long run all the men of the same country and the same period so alike that even in the case of individuals who would seem destined to escape this double influence, such as philosophers, learned men, and men of letters, thought and style have a family air which enables the age to which they belong to be immediately recognized. It is not necessary to talk for long with an individual to attain to a thorough knowledge of what he reads or his habitual occupations and of the surroundings amid which he lives. Contagion is so powerful that it forces upon individuals not only certain opinions but certain modes of feeling as well. Contagion is the cause of the contempt in which at a given period certain works are held. The example of Tannhauser may be cited, which a few years later, for the same reason, are admired by those who were foremost in criticizing them. The opinions and beliefs of crowds are specially propagated by contagion, but never by reasoning. The conceptions at present rife among the working classes have been acquired at the public house as the result of affirmation, repetition, and contagion. And indeed, the mode of creation of the beliefs of crowds of every age has scarcely been different. Renan justly institutes a comparison between the first founders of Christianity and the socialist working men spreading their ideas from public house to public house, while Voltaire had already observed in connection with the Christian religion that for more than 100 years it was only embraced by the vilest riffraff. It will be noted that in cases analogous to those I have just cited, contagion, after having been at work among the popular classes, has spread to the higher classes of society. This is what we see happening at the present day with regard to the socialist doctrines which are being to be held by those who will yet be their first victims. Contagion is so powerful a force that even the sentiment of personal interest disappears under its action. This is the explanation of the fact that every opinion adopted by the populace always ends up implanting itself with great vigor in the highest social strata, however obvious be the absurdity of the triumphant opinion. This reaction of the lower upon the higher social classes is the more curious, owing to the circumstance that the beliefs of the crowd always have their origin to a greater or less extent in some higher idea, which has often remained without influence in the sphere in which it was evolved. Leaders and agitators, subjugated by this higher idea, take hold of it, distort it, and create a sect which distorts it afresh, and then propagates it among the masses, who carry the process of deformation still further. Become a popular truth, the idea returns, as it were, to its source and exerts an influence on the upper classes of a nation. In the long run, it is intelligent that shapes the destiny of the world, but very indirectly. The philosophers who evolve ideas have long since returned to dust, when, as the result of the process I have just described, the fruit of their reflection ends by triumphing. 3. Prestige. Great power is given to ideas propagated by affirmation, repetition, and contagion by the circumstance that they acquire in time that mysterious force known as prestige. Whatever has been a ruling power in the world, whether it be ideas or men, has in the main enforced its authority by means of that irresistible force expressed by the word prestige. The term is one whose meaning is grasped by everybody, but the word is employed in ways too different for it to be easy to define it. Prestige may involve such sentiments as admiration or fear. Occasionally, even these sentiments are its basis, but it can perfectly well exist without them. The greatest measure of prestige is possessed by the dead, by beings, that is, of whom we do not stand in fear, by Alexander, Caesar, Muhammad, and Buddha, for example. On the other hand, there are fictive beings whom we do not admire. The monstrous divinities of the subterranean temples of India, for instance, but who strike us nevertheless as endowed with a great prestige. Prestige in reality is sort of a domination exercised on our mind by an individual, a work, or an idea. This domination entirely paralyzes our critical faculty and fills our soul with astonishment and respect. The sentiment provoked is inexplicable, like all sentiments, but it would appear to be of the same kind as the fascination to which a magnetized person is subjected. Prestige is the mainspring of all authority, and neither gods, kings, nor women have ever reigned without it. The various kinds of prestige may be grouped under two principal heads: acquired prestige and personal prestige. Acquired prestige is that resulting from name, fortune, and reputation. It may be independent of personal prestige. Personal prestige, on the contrary, is something essentially peculiar to the individual. It may coexist with reputation, glory, and fortune, or be strengthened by them, but it is perfectly capable of existing in their absence. Acquired or artificial prestige is much the most common. The mere fact that an individual occupies a certain position, possesses a certain fortune, or bears certain titles endows him with prestige, however slight his own personal worth. A soldier in uniform, a judge in his robes, always enjoys prestige. Pascal has very properly noted the necessity for judges of robes and wigs. Without them they would be stripped of half their authority. The most unbending socialist is always somewhat impressed by the sight of a prince or a marquise, and the assumption of such titles makes the robbing of tradesmen an easy matter. The prestige of which I have just spoken is exercised by persons side by side. With it may be placed that exercised by opinions, literary and artistic works. Prestige of the latter kind is most often merely the result of accumulated repetitions. History, literary and artistic history especially, being nothing more than the repetition of identical judgments, which nobody endeavors to verify. Everyone ends by repeating what he learnt at school, till there come to be names and things which nobody would venture to meddle with. For a modern reader, the perusal of Homer results incontestably in immense boredom, but who would venture to say so? The Parthenon in its present state is a wretched ruin, utterly destitute of interest, but it is endowed with such prestige that it does not appear to us as it really is, but with all its accompaniment of historic memories. The special characteristic of prestige is to prevent us seeing things as they are, and to entirely paralyze our judgment. Crowds always, and individuals as a rule, stand in need of ready-made opinions on all subjects. The popularity of these opinions is independent of the measure of truth or error they contain, and is solely regulated by their prestige. I now come to personal prestige. Its nature is very different from that of artificial or acquired prestige, with which I have just been concerned. It is a faculty independent of all titles, of all authority, and possessed by a small number of persons, whom it enables to exercise a veritably magnetic fascination on those around them, although they are socially their equals and lack all ordinary means of domination. They force the acceptance of their ideas and sentiments on those about them, and they are obeyed as is the tamer of wild beasts by the animal that could easily devour him. The great leaders of crowds, such as Buddha, Jesus, Muhammad, Joan of Arc, and Napoleon, have possessed this form of prestige in a high degree, and to this endowment is more particularly due the position they attained. Gods, heroes, and dogmas win their way in the world of their own inward strength. They are not to be discussed. They disappear, indeed, as soon as discussed. The great personages I have just cited were in possession of their power of fascination long before they became illustrious, and would never have become so without it. It is evident, for instance, that Napoleon, at the zenith of his glory, enjoyed an immense prestige by the mere fact of his power. But he was already endowed in part with this prestige when he was without power and completely unknown. When, an obscure general, he was sent, thanks to influential protection, to command the army of Italy, he found himself among rough generals, who were of a mind to give a hostile reception to the young intruder, dispatched them by the Directory. From the very beginning, from the first interview, without the aid of speeches, gestures, or threats, at the first sight of the man who was to become great, they were vanquished. Taine furnishes a curious account of this interview taken from contemporary memoirs. The generals of division, amongst others, Augereau, a sort of swashbuckler, uncouth and heroic, proud of his height and his bravery, arrive at the staff quarters very badly disposed toward the little upstart dispatched them from Paris. On the strength of the description of him that has been given them, Augereau is inclined to be insolent and insubordinate. A favorite of Barras, a general who owes his rank to the events of Vendemiaire, who has won his grade by street fighting, who is looked upon as bearish because he is always thinking in solitude, of poor aspect, and with the reputation of a mathematician and dreamer. They are introduced, and Bonaparte keeps them waiting. At last he appears. Girt with his sword, he puts on his hat, explains the measures he has taken, gives his orders, and dismisses them. Augereau has remained silent. It is only when he is outside that he regains his self-possession and is able to deliver himself of his customary oaths. He admits, with Massena, that this little devil of a general has inspired him with awe. He cannot understand the ascendancy by which from the very first he has felt himself overwhelmed. Become a great man. His prestige increased in proportion as his glory grew, and came to be at least equal to that of a divinity in the eyes of those devoted to him. General Van Damme, a rough, typical soldier of the Revolution, even more brutal and energetic than Augereau, said of him to Marshal d'Arnano in 1815, as on one occasion they mounted together the stairs of the Tuileries, "That devil of a man exercises a fascination on me that I cannot explain even to myself, and in such a degree that, though I fear neither God nor devil, when I am in his presence, I am ready to tremble like a child, and he could make me go through the eye of a needle to throw myself into the fire." Napoleon exercised a like fascination on all who came into contact with him. De Vaust used to say, talking of Maret's devotion and of his own, had the emperor said to us, "It is important in the interest of my policy that Paris should be destroyed without a single person leaving it or escaping," Marat, I am sure, would have kept the secret, but he could not have abstained from compromising himself by seeing that his family got clear of the city. On the other hand, I, for fear of letting the truth leak out, would have let my wife and children stay. It is necessary to bear in mind the astounding power exerted by fascination of this order, to understand that marvelous return from the Isle of Elba, that lightning-like conquest of France by an isolated man, confronted by all the organized forces of a great country that might have been supposed weary of his tyranny. He had merely to cast a look at the generals sent to lay hands on him, and who had sworn to accomplish their mission. All of them submitted without discussion. Napoleon, writes the English general Wolseley, lands in France almost alone, a fugitive from the small island of Elba, which was his kingdom, and succeeded in a few weeks, without bloodshed, in upsetting all organized authority in France under its legitimate king. Is it possible for the personal ascendancy of a man to affirm itself in a more astonishing manner? But from the beginning to the end of this campaign, which was his last, how remarkable, too, is the ascendancy he exercised over the Allies, obliging them to follow his initiative, and how near he came to crushing them. His prestige outlived him and continued to grow. It is his prestige that made an emperor of his obscure nephew. How powerful is his memory still is seen in the resurrection of his legend in progress at the present day. Ill-treat men as you will, massacre them by the millions, be the cause of invasion upon invasion, all is permitted you if you possess prestige in a sufficient degree and the talent necessary to uphold it. I have invoked, no doubt, in this case a quite exceptional example of prestige, but one it was useful to cite to make clear the genesis of great religions, great doctrines, and great empires. Were it not for the power exerted on the crowd by prestige, such growths would be incomprehensible. Prestige, however, is not based solely on personal ascendancy, military glory, and religious terror. It may have a more modest origin and still be considerable. Our century furnishes several examples. One of the most striking ones that posterity will recall from age to age will be supplied by the history of the illustrious man who modified the face of the globe and the commercial relations of the nations by separating two continents. He succeeded in his enterprise owing to his immense strength of will, but also owing to the fascination he exercised on those surrounding him. To overcome the unanimous opposition he met with, he had only to show himself. He would speak briefly, and in the face of charm he exerted, his opponents became his friends. The English in particular strenuously opposed his scheme. He had only to put in an appearance in England to rally all suffragists. In later years, when he passed Southampton, the bells were rung on his passage, and at the present day a movement is on foot in England to raise a statue in his honor. Having vanquished whatever there is to vanquish, men and things, marshes, rocks, and sandy wastes, he had ceased to believe in obstacles, and wished to begin Suez over again at Panama. He began again with the same methods as of old, but he had aged, and besides, the faith that moves mountains does not move them if they are too lofty. The mountains resisted, and the catastrophe that ensued destroyed the glittering aureole of glory that enveloped the hero. His life teaches how prestige can grow and how it can vanish. After rivaling in greatness the most famous heroes of history, he was lowered by the magistrates of his country to the ranks of the vilest criminals. When he died, his coffin, unattended, traversed an indifferent crowd. Foreign sovereigns are alone in rendering homage to his memory as to that of one of the greatest men that history has known. Still, the various examples that have just been cited represent extreme cases. To fix in detail the psychology of prestige, it would be necessary to place them at the extremity of a series, which would range from the founders of religions and empires to the private individual who endeavors to dazzle his neighbors by a new coat or decoration. Between the extreme limits of this series will find a place all the forms of prestige, resulting from the different elements composing a civilization, sciences, arts, literature, etc., and it would be seen that the prestige constitutes the fundamental element of persuasion. Consciously or not, the being, the idea, or the thing possessing prestige is immediately imitated in consequence of contagion, and forces an entire generation to adopt certain modes of feeling and of giving expression to its thoughts. This imitation, moreover, is, as a rule, unconscious, which accounts for the fact that it is perfect. The modern painters who copy the pale coloring and the stiff attitudes of some of the primitives are scarcely alive to the source of their inspiration. They believe in their own sincerity, whereas if an eminent master had not revived this form of art, people would have continued blind to all but its naive and inferior sides. Those artists who, after the manner of another illustrious master, inundate their canvases with violet shades, do not see in nature more violet than was detected there 50 years ago, but they are influenced, suggestioned by the personal and special impressions of a painter who, in spite of this eccentricity, was successful in acquiring great prestige. Similar examples might be brought forward in connection with all the elements of civilization. It is seen from what precedes that a number of factors may be concerned in the genesis of prestige. Among them, success was always one of the most important. Every successful man, every idea that forces itself into recognition, ceases ipso facto to be called in question. The proof that success is one of the principal stepping stones to prestige is that the disappearance of the one is almost always followed by the disappearance of the other. The hero whom the crowd acclaimed yesterday is insulted today should he have been overtaken by failure. The reaction, indeed, will be the stronger in proportion as the prestige has been great. The crowd in this case considers the fallen hero as an equal, and takes its revenge for having bowed to a superiority whose existence it no longer admits. While Robespierre was causing the execution of his colleagues and a great number of his contemporaries, he possessed an immense prestige. When the transposition of a few votes deprived him of power, he immediately lost his prestige, and the crowd followed him to the guillotine with the self-same imprecations with which shortly before it had pursued his victims. Believers always break the statues of their former gods with every symptom of fury. Prestige lost by want of success disappears in a brief space of time. It can also be worn away, but more slowly by being subjected to discussion. This latter power, however, is exceedingly sure. From the moment prestige is called in question, it ceases to be prestige. The gods and men who have kept their prestige for long have never tolerated discussion. For the crowd to admire, it must be kept at a distance. Chapter 4. Limitations of the variability of the beliefs and opinions of crowds. 1. Fixed beliefs. A close parallel exists between the anatomical and psychological characteristics of living beings. In these anatomical characteristics, certain invariable or slightly variable elements are met with. To change with the lapse is necessary of geological ages. Side by side with these fixed, indestructible features are to be found others extremely changeable, which the art of the breeder or horticulturist may easily modify, and at times to such an extent as to conceal the fundamental characteristics from an observer at all inattentive. The same phenomenon is observed in the case of moral characteristics. Alongside the unalterable psychological elements of a race, mobile and changeable elements are to be encountered. For this reason, in studying the beliefs and opinions of a people, the presence is always detected of a fixed groundwork on which are engrafted opinions as changing as the surface sand on a rock. The opinions and beliefs of crowds may be divided then into two very distinct classes. On the one hand, we have a great permanent beliefs, which endure for several centuries, and on which an entire civilization may rest. Such, for instance, in the past were feudalism, Christianity, and Protestantism, and such in our own time are the nationalist principle in contemporary democratic and social ideas. In the second place, there are the transitory, changing opinions, the outcome, as a rule, of general conceptions, of which every age sees the birth and disappearance. Examples in point are the theories which mold literature and the arts, those, for instance, which produced Romanticism, Naturalism, Mysticism, etc. Opinions of this order are as superficial, as a rule, as fashioned, and as changeable. They may be compared to the ripples which ceaselessly arise and vanish on the surface of a deep lake. The great generalized beliefs are very restricted in number. Their rise and fall form the culminating points of the history of every historic race. They constitute the real framework of civilization. It is easy to imbue the mind of crowds with a passing opinion, but very difficult to implant therein a lasting belief. However, a belief of this latter description once established, it is equally difficult to uproot it. It is usually only to be changed at the cost of violent revolutions. Even revolutions can only avail when the belief has almost entirely lost its sway over men's minds. In that case, revolution serves to finally sweep away what had already been almost cast aside. Through the force of habit, prevented its complete abandonment. The beginning of a revolution is in reality the end of a belief. The precise moment at which a great belief is doomed is easily recognizable. It is the moment when its value begins to be called in question. Every general belief being little else than a fiction, it can only survive on the condition that it be not subjected to examination. But even when a belief is severely shaken, the institutions to which it has given rise retain their strength and disappear but slowly. Finally, when the belief has completely lost its force, all that rests upon it is soon involved in ruin. As yet a nation has never been able to change its beliefs without being condemned at the same time to transform all the elements of its civilization. The nation continues this process of transformation until it has alighted on and accepted a new general belief. Until this juncture, it is perforce in a state of anarchy. General beliefs are the indispensable pillars of civilizations. They determine the trend of ideas. They alone are capable of inspiring faith and creating a sense of duty. Nations have always been conscious of the utility of acquiring general beliefs, and have instinctively understood that their disappearance would be the signal for their own decline. In the case of the Romans, the fanatical cult of Rome was the belief that made them masters of the world. And when the belief had died out, Rome was doomed to die. As for the barbarians who destroyed the Roman civilization, it was only when they had acquired certain common accepted beliefs that they attained a measure of cohesion and emerged from anarchy. Plainly, it is not for nothing that nations have always displayed intolerance in the defense of their opinions. This intolerance, open as it is to criticism from the philosophic standpoint, represents in the life of a people the most necessary of virtues. It was to found or uphold general beliefs that so many victims were sent to the stake in the Middle Ages, and that so many inventors and innovators have died in despair, even if they have escaped martyrdom. It is in defense, too, of such beliefs that the world has been so often the scene of the direst disorder, and that so many millions of men have died on the battlefield and will yet die there. There are great difficulties in the way of establishing a general belief, but when it is definitely implanted, its power is for a long time to come invincible. And however false it be philosophically, it imposes itself upon the most luminous intelligence. Have not the European peoples regarded as incontrovertible for more than 15 centuries religious legends which, closely examined, are as barbarous as those of Moloch. The frightful absurdity of the legend of a god who revenges himself for the disobedience of one of his creatures by inflicting horrible tortures on his son remained unperceived during many centuries. Such potent geniuses as a Galileo, a Newton, and a Leibniz never supposed for an instant that the truth of such dogmas could be called in question. Nothing can be more typical than this fact of the hypnotizing effect of general beliefs. But at the same time, nothing can mark more decisively the humiliating limitations of our intelligence. As soon as a new dogma is implanted in the mind of crowds, it becomes the source of inspiration, whence are evolved its institutions, arts, and mode of existence. The sway it exerts over men's minds under these circumstances is absolute. Men of action have no thought beyond realizing the accepted belief, legislators beyond applying it, while philosophers, artists, and men of letters are solely preoccupied with its expression under various shapes. From the fundamental belief, transient accessory ideas may arise, but they always bear the impress of the belief from which they have sprung. The Egyptian civilization, the European civilization of the Middle Ages, the Muslim civilization of the Arabs are all the outcome of a small number of religious beliefs which have left their mark on the least important elements of these civilizations and allow of their immediate recognition. Thus, it is that, thanks to general beliefs, the men of every age are enveloped in a network of traditions, opinions, and customs which render them all alike, and from whose yoke they cannot extricate themselves. Men are guided in their conduct above all by their beliefs, and by the customs that are the consequence of those beliefs. These beliefs and customs regulate the smallest acts of our existence, and the most independent spirit cannot escape their influence. The tyranny exercised unconsciously on men's minds is the only real tyranny, because it cannot be fought against. Tiberius, Genghis Khan, and Napoleon were assuredly redoubtable tyrants, but from the depth of their graves, Moses, Buddha, Jesus, and Muhammad have exerted on the human soul a far profounder despotism. A conspiracy may overthrow a tyrant, but what can it avail against a firmly established belief? In its violent struggle with Roman Catholicism, it is the French Revolution that has been vanquished, and this in spite of the fact that the sympathy of the crowd was apparently on its side, and in spite of recourse to destructive measures as pitiless as those of the Inquisition. The only real tyrants that humanity has known have always been the memories of its dead or the illusions it has forged itself. The philosophic absurdity that often marks general beliefs has never been an obstacle to their triumph. Indeed, the triumph of such beliefs would seem impossible unless on the condition that they offer some mysterious absurdity. In consequence, the evident weakness of the socialist beliefs of today will not prevent them triumphing among the masses. Their real inferiority to all religious beliefs is solely the result of this consideration, that the ideal of happiness offered by the latter being realizable only in a future life, it was beyond the power of anybody to contest it. The socialist ideal of happiness being intended to be realized on earth, the vanity of its promises will at once appear as soon as the first efforts toward their realization are made, and simultaneously the new belief will entirely lose its prestige. Its strength, in consequence, will only increase until the day when, having triumphed, its practical realization shall commence. For this reason, while the new religion exerts, to begin with, like all those that have preceded it, a destructive influence, it will be unable in the future to play a creative part. 2. The changeable opinions of crowds. Above the substratum of fixed beliefs, whose power we have just demonstrated, is found an overlying growth of opinions, ideas, and thoughts, which are incessantly springing up and dying out. Some of them exist but for a day, and the more important scarcely outlive a generation. We have already noted that the changes which supervene in opinions of this order are at times far more superficial than real, and that they are always affected by racial considerations. When examining, for instance, the political institutions of France, we showed that parties to all appearance utterly distinct, royalists, radicals, imperialists, socialists, etc., have an ideal absolutely identical, and that this ideal is solely dependent on the mental structure of the French race, since a quite contrary ideal is found under analogous names among other races. Neither the name given to opinions nor deceptive adaptations alter the essence of things. The men of the Great Revolution, saturated with Latin literature, who, their eyes fixed on the Roman Republic, adopted its laws, its fasces, and its togas, did not become Romans because they were under the empire of a powerful historical suggestion. The task of the philosopher is to investigate what it is which subsists of ancient beliefs beneath their apparent changes, and to identify amid the moving flux of opinions the part determined by general beliefs and the genius of the race. In the absence of this philosophic test, it might be supposed that crowds change their political or religious beliefs frequently and at will. All history, whether political, religious, artistic, or literary, seems to prove that such is the case. As an example, let us take a very short period of French history, merely that from 1790 to 1820, a period of 30 years' duration, that of a generation. In the course of it, we see the crowd, at first monarchical, become very revolutionary, then very imperialist, and again very monarchical. In the matter of religion, it gravitates in the same lapse of time from Catholicism to atheism, then towards deism, and then returns to the most pronounced forms of Catholicism. These changes take place not only amongst the masses, but also amongst those who direct them. We observe with astonishment the prominent men of the convention, the sworn enemies of kings, men who would have neither gods nor masters, become the humble servants of Napoleon, and afterwards, under Louis the 18th, piously carry candles in religious processions. Numerous, too, are the changes in the opinions of the crowds in the course of the following 70 years. The perfidious Albion of the opening of the century is the ally of France under Napoleon's heir. Russia, twice invaded by France, which looked on with satisfaction at French reverses, becomes its friend. In literature, art, and philosophy, the successive evolutions of opinion are more rapid still. Romanticism, naturalism, mysticism, etc. spring up and die out in turn. The artist and the writer applauded yesterday are treated on the morrow with profound contempt. When, however, we analyze all these changes in appearance so far-reaching, what do we find? All those that are in opposition with the general beliefs and sentiments of the race are of transient duration, and the diverted stream soon resumes its course. The opinions which are not linked to any general belief or sentiment of the race, and which in consequence cannot possess stability, are at the mercy of every chance, or, if the expression be preferred, of every change in the surrounding circumstances. Formed by suggestion and contagion, they are always momentary. They crop up and disappear as rapidly on occasion as the sandhills formed by the wind on the seacoast. At the present day, the changeable opinions of crowds are greater in number than they ever were, and for three different reasons. The first is that as the old beliefs are losing their influence to a greater and greater extent, they are ceasing to shape the ephemeral opinions of the moment as they did in the past. The weakening of general beliefs clears the ground for a crop of haphazard opinions without a past or a future. The second reason is that the power of crowds being on the increase, and this power being less and less counterbalanced, the extreme mobility of ideas, which we have seen to be a peculiarity of crowds, can manifest itself without let or hindrance. Finally, the third reason is the recent development of the newspaper press, by whose agency the most contrary opinions are being continually brought before the attention of crowds. The suggestions that might result from each individual opinion are soon destroyed by suggestions of an opposite character. The consequence is that no opinion succeeds in becoming widespread, and that the existence of all of them is ephemeral. An opinion nowadays dies out before it has found a sufficiently wide acceptance to become general. A phenomenon quite new in the world's history and most characteristic of the present age has resulted from these different causes. I allude to the powerlessness of governments to direct opinion. In the past, and in no very distant past, the action of governments and the influence of a few writers and a very small number of newspapers constituted the real reflectors of public opinion. Today, the writers have lost all influence, and the newspapers only reflect opinion. As for statesmen, far from directing opinion, their only endeavor is to follow it. They have a dread of opinion, which amounts at times to terror, and causes them to adopt an utterly unstable line of conduct. The opinion of crowds tends, then, more and more, to become the supreme guiding principle in politics. It goes so far today as to force on alliances, as has been seen recently in the case of the Franco-Russian alliance, which is solely the outcome of a popular movement. A curious symptom of the present time is to observe popes, kings, and emperors consent to be interviewed as a means of submitting their views on a given subject to the judgment of crowds. Formerly, it might have been correct to say that politics were not a matter of sentiment. Can the same be said today, when politics are more and more swayed by the impulse of changeable crowds who are uninfluenced by reason and can only be guided by sentiment? As to the press, which formerly directed opinion, it has had, like governments, to humble itself before the power of crowds. It wields, no doubt, a considerable influence, but only because it is exclusively the reflection of the opinions of crowds and of their incessant variations. Become a mere agency for the supply of information, the press has renounced all endeavor to enforce an idea or a doctrine. It follows all the changes of public thought, obliged to do so by the necessities of competition under pain of losing its readers. The old staid and influential organs of the past, such as the Constitutionnel, the Débats, or the Cécile, which were accepted as oracles by the preceding generation, have disappeared or have become typical modern papers in which a maximum of news is sandwiched in between light articles, society gossip, and financial puffs. There can be no question today of a paper rich enough to allow its contributors to air their personal opinions, and such opinions would be of slight weight with readers who only ask to be kept informed or to be amused, and who suspect every affirmation of being prompted by motives of speculation. Even the critics have ceased to be able to assure the success of a book or a play. They are capable of doing harm, but not of doing a service. The papers are so conscious of the uselessness of everything in the shape of criticism or personal opinion that they have reached the point of suppressing literary criticism, confining themselves to citing the title of a book and appending a puff or 2 or 3 lines. In 20 years' time, the same fate will probably have overtaken theatrical criticism. The close watching of the course of opinion has become today the principal preoccupation of the press and of governments. The effect produced by an event, a legislative proposal, a speech, is without intermission what they require to know, and the task is not easy, for nothing is more mobile and changeable than the thought of crowds, and nothing more frequent than to see them execrate today what they applauded yesterday. This total absence of any sort of direction of opinion, and at the same time the destruction of general beliefs, have had for final result an extreme divergency of convictions of every order, and a growing indifference on the part of crowds to everything that does not plainly touch their immediate interest. Questions of doctrine, such as socialism, only recruit champions boasting genuine convictions among the quiet, illiterate classes. Among the workers in mines and factories, for instance, members of the lower middle class, and working men possessing some degree of instruction, have either become utterly skeptical or extremely unstable in their opinions. The evolution which has been effected in this direction in the last 25 years is striking. During the preceding period, comparatively near us though it is, opinion still had a certain general trend. They had their origin in the acceptance of some fundamental belief. By the mere fact that an individual was a monarchist, he possessed inevitably certain clearly defined ideas in history as well as in science, while by the mere fact that he was a Republican, his ideas were quite contrary. A monarchist was well aware that men are not descended from monkeys, and a Republican was not less well aware that such is in truth their descent. It was the duty of the monarchist to speak with horror, and of the Republican to speak with veneration of the great revolution. There were certain names, such as those of Robespierre and Marat, that had to be uttered with an air of religious devotion, and other names, such as those of Caesar, Augustus, or Napoleon, that ought never to be mentioned unaccompanied by a torrent of invective. Even in the French Sorbonne, this ingenious fashion of conceiving history was general. At the present day, as the result of discussion and analysis, all opinions are losing their prestige. Their distinctive features are rapidly worn away, and few survive capable of arousing our enthusiasm. The man of modern times is more and more a prey to indifference. The general wearing away of opinions should not be too greatly deplored. That it is a symptom of decadence in the life of a people cannot be contested. It is certain that men of immense, of almost supernatural insight, that apostles, leaders of crowds, men, in a word, of genuine and strong convictions, exert a far greater force than men who deny, who criticize, or who are indifferent. But it must not be forgotten that, given the power possessed at present by crowds, were a single opinion to acquire sufficient prestige to enforce its general acceptance, it would soon be endowed with so tyrannical a strength that everything would have to bend before it, and the era of free discussion would be closed for a long time. Crowds are occasionally easygoing masters, as were Heliogabalus and Tiberius, but they are also violently capricious. A civilization, when the moment has come for crowds to acquire a high hand over it, is at the mercy of too many chances to endure for long. Could anything postpone for a while the hour of its ruin? it would be precisely the extreme instability of the opinions of crowds and their growing indifference with respect to all general beliefs. End of Book 2.